All right. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. We are back with another Locked In Real Conversations. And today's episode is going to be about Black men, mental health, and emotional silence, part one. So, yes, it's going to be a two-part series that I'm very passionate about. So, again, with Locked In Real Conversations, where beauty meets healing, I am your host, Unique. I'm the owner of Unique Locks and Beauty Bar. So, today's conversation is definitely one that deserves like honesty, vulnerability, and real reflection. So, we're talking about Black men and mental health and emotional silence. So, for generations, uh, many generations, I could just say going back, Black men were taught to survive, provide, protect, but not always taught how to express emotions safely. So, many were told to like man up, and I know I'm guilty of it. I have a 3-year-old son, and I'm like, you're a boy, you don't need to cry about everything. Or keep pushing, or stay quiet, or just carry the
So,
stress, or trauma, heartbreak, pressure, whatever they have, and just carry it in silence with no outlet. So today, I want to create a space for a deeper conversation where Black men truly need to feel emotionally safe, vulnerable, and supported. I think the most overlooked realities is that many Black men don't avoid the emotions. I don't think that they avoid them. I think they feel them. I think they know that they feel them. Um, and they don't avoid them because they don't have them. But I think they do avoid them because either starting growing up, like I said, I could just talk about myself with my son. Maybe I didn't create a emotional safe space for him to express that. So, I want to introduce you guys today. We have Mark Jones, and he is a licensed social worker working at Advanced Counseling Solutions right here in Austin Town. So he's my neighbor. So Mark, I'll let you introduce yourself and then we'll dive right in.
absolutely. Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Mark Jones. I'm a clinical therapist here at Advanced Counseling. I've been here for 4 years at this point, but I've been in the field, I would say at least 12 plus years at this rate. And I'm grateful for the topic today. Like I'm really, really excited about this because I just don't think there's enough energy about men's mental health overall. I know we're going to pay maybe a closer attention to Black men particularly, but like I like to come from a perspective of just men as a whole, more or less because I just think a lot of division creates more issues. And I
Yeah,
think when more people divide, as when more people specify like this race thing and it makes it only about that, it puts more pressure opposed
yeah,
to just being one gender. Like we're just men as a whole deal with these particular things because of societal influences. And largely I think it comes from more of social economic status. You get
mhm,
into like these things about manning up and being tough and not showing emotion and things like that. So like I'm really grateful about the topic. So I can't wait to dive in.
oh, perfect. So I want to jump with that. So let's just change it from Black men to just men. Let's just do that. I like that because I don't want anyone to feel like left out, like they don't have these same struggles. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? Everybody from all walks of life could have the same struggle.
Absolutely.
So from your perspective, why do so many men struggle with emotional vulnerability and maybe like openness?
I think like we were talking about in the introduction, I think a lot of guys particularly struggle with the safety of having this outlet because things been so callous within them, being like men have this quote unquote identity that you got to fit this mold, right?
Mm,
And because of that, and I just think how fast society grows, we have this vision just like as beings what this should look like, and usually it's this like 7 foot tall, masculine guy. He's gonna be like this superhero, whatever. He can never cry, he can never have this thing. And like unconsciously, we influence it, right? Like we do it in
yeah.
commercials, we do it in TV shows, we do it in language, we even use like religious wording to
Mhm.
demonstrate it. Like we do, and then like people don't ever consider you. We are vessels, right? So like we hearing this all the time, and you callous it in your mind, and then you start acting it out unconsciously, just very naturally. You start doing this, and then it creates this wedge because guys oftentimes like, no, I feel this thing, like I am really upset about this. So this does really make me sad. Like why can't I express this? Or like why do I? But like and then the other aspect is you tell me you want me to express this, but it's not safe for me to express it, or I only can express it just this little bit, or
Mhm.
I express it wrong because I'm supposed to be tough, you know? So like it's like
Yeah.
if I got all of these questions on how I'm allowed to express it, I might as well not express it if I can't, like if I have an avenue to express it.
Mhm.
So which leads to a cause and effect. Like so when I think about like just mental health as a whole, the cause is no safe outlet to express these struggles, right? Because of this influence or this identity that I must fit up to.
Yeah.
Now I'm gonna have this outlet of some extreme behavior, which could be aggression, it could be substance, it could be,
Mhm.
just a lot. Because I want to avoid the pressure.
Correct.
So, in my opinion, I think that's how that tends to happen.
Okay, so like to piggyback off what you're saying, how we see it on TV,
Mhm.
religious ways, things like that, or how I even mentioned, I was taught, boys don't cry,
Mhm.
things like that.
Mhm.
So do you think that it could kind of begin in childhood? And would it make a difference if, like, let's say, for instance, me, a single mom,
Mhm.
or a two-parent household where dad is, more dominant in
Mhm.
raising, their sons.
Mhm.
Do you feel like it could start from childhood and then the influence of social media, TV, things like that as well?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I feel like, there's no manual on parenting, right? So like oftentimes what we tend to desire as adults is something that you missed as a child, that you wanted as a child. And people never think about that, but that's the flip of it.
Mhm.
If your parents just didn't provide an emotional space for you to just be like emotionally open for whatever reason, right? Life happens. Maybe they were just a household where both parents had to work, so it was more like more of like emotions was kind of like back burner. It wasn't like this bonding thing, but more like I'm mom, I'm dad, you're a child, you fed, you go to school, you do your thing,
Mhm.
I work,
Yeah.
and then some people have like genuine relationships that was able to go through these steps, you know what I mean? And that creates a different thing. But if there was something in that development piece as a child that you did not get, you as an adult provide a lot of it because you want that and you desire that
Hmm.
because it was a missing piece.
Yeah.
Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Okay. Okay.
So like that's even helping like in relationships. Like people don't think about that, but like if as a man, for example, if you grew up in a household where your parents were or your father figure was extremely dominant over you,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
As a young boy, as a man, you're going to desire dominance because you never experienced, you didn't get it.
Mm.
Does that make sense? If
Yeah.
if
Okay.
you didn't, if you get where I'm coming from?
Yeah, for sure. So I think I could, now you're making me reflect on my relationships. I think a lot of relationships that I've gotten into, we kind of like, if we want to use technical terms, trauma bonded over some things that we lacked in our childhood.
Sure.
You know what I mean? So I was raised by
Mhm.
my aunt, maybe they were raised by their grandparents or whatever the case may be. And so they had a different dynamic than I did. And
Mhm.
so I seek someone that can give me some rest, but maybe my partner seeks someone who leads.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so I never thought about that. until, we start working these things out with these interviews. I'm like, okay, so it could stem from childhood and traumas and things like that. And they desire something that they were lacking then. So that makes perfect sense to me.
Absolutely. Like, I mean, like in my own personal life, I'm very fortunate just to be like of culture as a black man to have a father in a household. But like the way my parents worked, they had to get it. They were very young parents. They were trying to, they was working.
Hmm.
So they taught me independence very young. But it shaped me to be a different father in my today life, right? So like now in my today life, I want to be involved in my kids' activities just because my parents couldn't be involved in mine. Not because they didn't want to. Circumstances was just different. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So
Yep.
like, and that's what I'm saying. Like people don't ever consider, but like a lot of that comes from your childhood. Like what did work or didn't work, you tend to act that out in other ways as an adult.
Hmm. And I can definitely agree with that. Like my mom, she was a police officer and then turned
Hmm.
detective. And then, my stepdad at that time, he was overseas for almost like 10 years under, the Bush and Clinton administration. So I literally developed a relationship with him over Zoom, and he taught me things over Zoom. I mean, well, back then we had Skype.
Yeah.
We had Skype back then.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
um but my mom worked all the time, and I was
Yeah.
in gymnastics,
Hmm.
basketball, track.
Hmm.
She rarely showed up to anything.
Hmm.
And, I felt that. So
Hmm.
in turn, I followed into, some same what we call generational curses, and I had children young, and I knew that I was going to have to work very hard.
Hmm.
But I did say in my mind, I said, by the time they get to high school, where I felt like in my mind it truly mattered, that I needed to be in a position that I could be more involved. A lot of times, when you're in the work industry, I was working on Christmas, and I was missing parent teacher conference because I had to be at work. And so I was absent a lot. And I know it was very important how I felt with my mom being absent on most important events. I mean, she even missed my graduation.
Oh, tough.
You know
I'm
what I
sorry.
mean? Due
Hmm.
to,
Hmm.
you know what I mean? Police duty, it never stopped.
Circumstances. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
Hmm.
So, but I wanted to make sure that I was intentional. So, God worked it out, that I was able to own my own business, and now I make my schedule. So if my daughter was just inducted into the National Honor Society, I blocked off my schedule because I have to be there.
Nah.
So that
Yeah.
makes a good point of,
Mhm.
what we're trying to compensate, and to me, overcompensate for the things that I've lacked in my childhood.
But these are two good examples of like growth too, right? Like I think oftentimes, especially in our communities, people don't talk about the growth of generational change because of the sacrifices your mom did make. You are in a position where you can attend these things, and
Hmm.
now your kids going forth will be able to express this in their love and development as they extend the family legacy. Does that make sense? You know what I mean?
Yes.
So
Yes.
like I oftentimes think like too, we tend to look at our humble beginnings as a lot of struggle pains opposed to like see the growth in this in itself because it is progress.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess I shouldn't be so hard on my mom
No, because I
as
mean,
an adult now.
yeah, yeah,
So let's just piggyback on like those statements that, society would make, or like our fathers would make, our mothers would make, whatever. Like, how do the phrases man up or be strong or boys don't cry kind of like emotionally impact men over time?
well, those every time you get into those type of statements, those are titles. You trying to mold this individual into this. And all that does is set a bar where now you're expecting this individual to achieve,
Mm,
right? So like now because you created this dynamic and manning up and whatever that means to you, now this child must do all his behaviors to look to your gratification to say this is what manhood should look like. And I don't know if that's fair. You know what I mean? Like my life was vastly different than the life my father lived.
mm,
And I would imagine in his era and time, growing up in the '60s, his challenges was a lot different than the challenges that I had to go through. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So his ideal of manhood in that time period was vastly different than the ideal of manhood that he was actually providing for me because I didn't have to go through the struggles and tough things that he went through. Does that make sense?
Oh, perfect. Perfect.
So opposed to someone saying, you shouldn't cry or boys don't cry, I always think like people should be more uh, think about real tangible traits that you want any individual to have. Like my father always told me about manhood means that individual is going to be accountable for their actions, good or bad. Like that's what manhood means. Like if I tell your mom I'm gonna be home for dinner and I don't come home for dinner, I need to be accountable for that
Mm.
because I was wrong. Does that make
Yeah.
sense? So
Perfect.
to me, every time he scolded me for something I didn't do, he was like, "Son, you're not being accountable. You're not being a man. Like this is what I expect out of." And that has zero to do with if I should be able to express myself emotionally. He made a space. But at the end of the day, are you going to be accountable for your action, which you did in the situation? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
It's weighted different.
that's a good foundation to have. I feel like if say you did make a mistake, and you are allowed to be upset or, feel a guilty about it. However, we still do need to be accountable for the mistake that you did make. So that's a good foundation that I think maybe a lot of people aren't being taught, or they didn't have that same foundation that your dad planted for you.
I think for our culture largely, I just think it's the lack of the communication. Like we're not intentional with the words we use or the wording we use, right?
Hmm.
But like a lot of times I just genuinely believe our behaviors, we want this, right? We seeking to teach about accountability, right? We
Yes.
seeking to teach about leadership and when you have to like really put it together, right? So you
Yeah.
can like get over the challenge, right? Like I think a lot of times our behaviors want to express that, but due to like limitations in communication and dialogue, right?
Hmm.
We just miss the shot. So then, it gets into these things. But I don't think it's like some people do it intentionally. I just think a lot of times people do best with what they have or what they've been groomed to have.
I think to kind of like carry on with what you're saying, I think in our culture, and I know for sure, my mom never really explained things,
Mm-hmm.
or you know what I mean? There was no why to it. It was do
Mm-hmm.
as I say. So
Mm-hmm.
I now, with my own therapy, I now, explain even to my 3-year-old, okay, you cannot throw this ball at the TV because it will break. Don't
Mm-hmm.
throw that ball at the TV. You know what I mean? Well, why
Mm-hmm.
not? I've been
Mm-hmm.
throwing it. I've been throwing the ball, so why not?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think now I feel like a lot of people say like this generation is soft, but I feel like they're the generation of why. Why
Mm-hmm.
do I need to be accountable for my actions? Or why do I need to think about my actions, calm down when they just hurt me or said some things that are hurting me? Because now, a lot of our generation, our younger generation, like my children and, teens, they just automatically react.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like if the communication was there, the why behind the communication was there, I think that it would be a less reactive and they could think about it, is this even worth it? Is it worth it?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a really great point. Like, and I hope one day when you do another episode, I will love to get on this topic too because this is another one of my favorite topics. But
Yeah.
I think the disconnect between I would say my generation as a millennial and these younger generations is a lot of us as millennials we grew up with each other because our parents were working. Does that make sense? So we had to communicate. We had to, we weren't trapped behind computers and things like that. We had to like really mature a lot faster because just where we were at in society. Does that make sense? So
Oh, for
like, I would think a
sure.
lot of times as millennials looking down upon this new generation, there's a lot of frustration because I feel like a lot of my peers look at this generation like, why can't they figure this stuff out for themselves? But because we pave such a way, they are being kids a lot longer than what we were. And that's kind of what you want, but people are missing it. Does that make sense? And they don't
Guilty.
have the opportunity also too, just in today's society, they don't have a lot of opportunities where they are forced to learn these things at an early age. Like we had recess. Play is a big thing with other kids because you have to communicate. You have to ask, can we share toys? We have can you handle rejection if they don't want to play with you? You know what I mean? Like, can you, you know what I mean? Like, you had, like, these things were in our everyday life. And a lot of this, especially post COVID, these kids are missing. So then parents are looking at them like, well, what's the issue? I don't get it. They never were taught it. So, like, yeah, this 14-year-old you looking at, of course, they don't know how to problem solve if they never had the opportunity to problem solve.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm a part of the problem. I'm guilty.
Stop it.
Because literally, I became self-sufficient at like 6, 7 years old. My mom bought me a, it had to have been this big of a
Hmm.
ironing board.
Hmm.
And she literally taught me how to iron, 6, 7 years old. I'm doing dishes. I know how to cook my first meal by like 9 or 10. And so I was like, I just want to be a kid. So
Hmm.
when I had kids, I'm like, yeah, I'm not teaching you doing that. And
Hmm.
then one day, I'll never forget, I was working and I think I didn't even get off until almost like 1 or 2 in the morning. I was a manager for Apple and
Hmm.
at work from home. And um, I forgot to put the kids' clothes in the dryer for school. And my
Hmm.
daughter banged on the door, like, my clothes aren't dry. Fourth grade, fourth grade. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm like trying to get myself together. And I'm like, oh, no, 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 no. Now's the time. Now I have to teach you how to be able to take the clothes out of the washer machine and put them in here. Now it's not, now we got to get it together. Because
That's
I was
wild.
like literally being like Cinderella because why are you having to clean your own room and wash dishes and do all this stuff when you're
Hmm.
just a child? And
Hmm.
now I'm like, you guys don't do anything. I have to pick up
Hmm.
after you all the
Yeah.
time. But I
Hmm.
had created that because I thought the way that I grew up was I was too far advanced to be 7 and could stay at home by myself or you know what I mean? I was cutting grass, my neighbor's grass at like
Hmm.
12, making
Hmm.
money. And
Hmm.
this year, like if you can't get on TikTok and make money,
Yeah.
then they don't want to do it.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's perfect. That's a perfect understanding on how we can kind of view and maybe we can kind of transition to help our youth be more
Absolutely.
self-sufficient because with things are going on, like, do you guys even know I had home ec in
Yeah.
school? You know, they don't even teach them how to cook in school.
Right.
So
Right. I,
um
I think
that's
that I
perfect.
just as parents, we just got to remember we want to parent in the with the purpose in mind, you creating healthy adults one day.
Yeah.
And the reality is giving kids chores and responsibilities teaches them accountability, reward, all those positive traits you want them to have as an adult. It's that simple.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. That's simple. Just I just thought my mom's or not even my mom, like our generation, even
Mhm.
other households, like, girl, like this your house, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
let's transition into some more things about like men and what they struggle with emotionally.
Sure.
Is there any signs, as you being a licensed therapist, what are some of the signs that men may be emotionally struggling, even if they never say it out loud? Um, I'll never forget. I met this guy and he was short. And I've always in the back of my head, I think it was my great grandmother. She goes, short men have anger issues. And I'd be like, okay. So then, like, when he would be upset
Sure.
with me or upset just in general, I'd be like, it's because you're short, huh? You know what I mean? And,
Stop it. No way.
but he was actually going through some things but couldn't
Mhm.
express it. And then at that time, now because I'm mocking you in some sort of way, now I'm not a safe space for you to actually tell me what's going on. So, maybe as a woman with, a partner or a
Mhm.
mother looking at, like,
Mhm.
I have a 20-year-old son too. What are some signs that I could possibly see or feel that they are struggling emotionally?
I think for men particularly, so much society doesn't allow men to express emotions like in a safe space in general, just because of the perception of being strong or what this alleged identity of manhood looks like. But largely, most men are going to suppress. So, like, whatever they are going through, they're going to suppress. And when you suppress, it is a ticking a bomb waiting to go off. Like, that's all it is. So you only have so much. And I'm like looking around because I want to really give you an example. If I had like I'm gonna use my bottle. Like, if you
Yeah.
suppress
Uh-huh.
and you keep just suppressing all this emotion down and down, at some point it's only so much room, right? And once you get
Mm-hmm.
there, then a lot of times with just men, I've seen there's gonna be some kind of explosive behavior, like either extreme avoidance, like they're gonna just not want to be involved. They're going to either be extreme with like substance use or like just anger. If their anger is like imbalanced, like they just really temperamental, if you will, like they specking up or specking down. Like a lot of that comes from just suppressing of emotions, like not having the space to truly express how they feel unapologetically.
Hmm. Okay. So let's talk about avoidance. So kids, let's just talk about like the teenagers or,
Sure.
adolescents, preteens, and they have that shift in hormones and things like that. And so they become avoidant.
Mm-hmm.
And some parents will be like, oh, well, he's just going through a phase. But how can we as parents or let's say teachers or therapists or community leaders notice the avoidance or notice the standoffish and kind of not force but kind of like bridge that gap together and say, hey, this is a safe space, what's going on, I noticed a shift in you, without them shutting down.
Sure. That's an excellent question. I think everybody's very unique, but if I had to make this very black and white, I would say this would really go around, and I wrote this down too because I thought this was very. I really think this would go around space, opportunity, and support. Okay,
Mm.
so those concepts: space, opportunity, support.
Okay.
Space to make a plan. Usually, a lot of hormones, teens are going through this little funky stage where they're still kids, but they're verging on adult life. I want some independence, but independence is kind of scary. I kind of want to still rely on mom and dad, but I do want to buy my own things. They go into this thing, right?
Mhm.
And you want to provide them space because usually with all of this, a lot is happening. And the biggest thing that's happening is where they fit at socially.
Mm. So it
So,
might not have anything to do with
and as
hormones.
parents, right? And as
Okay.
parents, we usually take it offensive, like why they don't want to hang out with us, but like they're like almost starting to leave the nest at that point. It's like I need to find out where I fit in at socially.
Hmm.
You get what I'm saying? So creating a space for them to make a plan to get more acceptance there, and also make an opportunity. This is the opportunity piece to express that to you, show you where they at, invite you into their world, right? And
Yeah.
then the last part of that will be about support. Like as a parent, in mind, thinking about creating healthy adults, how do you create a space where supportive, even if you don't necessarily agree with the dialogue,
Hmm.
you can be supportive and still express why you may disagree with something, right? So
Okay.
like, we was talking about accountability about what my old man used to teach me. my old man would tell me like to my face because his one of his biggest things was about honesty. So he was like, if you're gonna make a dumb decision, like you your own man, you're gonna make that dumb decision regardless of how I feel one way or the other. But I'm
Mm,
gonna tell you why I feel this way, and I'm
okay.
gonna leave it up to you. You know what I mean? So like, you know where I stand at. If you make this decision, this is what how we're gonna go forth. But
Mm,
this is why. You know what I mean? But like, and it was very that like he didn't he made it a way for me to make a choice and me understanding the outcome of the choice I'm gonna make without feeling pressure of like one way or the other. Does that make sense?
yeah, I think that's good. I think that way of parenting is good, and I think that we can adapt from that because I feel like I've carried on some traits where no, you're just not going to do it.
Sure.
Now, like I do have a daughter, she's turning 18 in two
Mm-hmm.
weeks.
Yeah.
And, she's going to be an adult.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there's not much that I can do or say from that point, but I can express to you how I feel about the choices that you're making, lay out some, cause
Sure.
and effect,
Mm-hmm.
consequences,
Yeah.
and then, leave it up to you.
To make a choice. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really
You,
healthy. I really, that's
you know,
that's really healthy. Yeah.
I, we all gonna fall short in some ways. It always sound easier, you know what I mean, like in this open discussion or whatever. But like it's just a learning skill. Like you just and this is going back to earlier, right? Earlier we discussed a lot of things that you did not get as a child,
Mm-hmm.
you're gonna desire as an adult or try to influence as an adult, right?
Yep.
And we also discussed earlier it's a cause and effect, right? And a lot of times that cause and effect is played by lack of communication, like purposeful communication.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I'm very fortunate to have a father in the household, and I'm very fortunate to have a godfather that played a major part in my life. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And he was very, very communicative. Like he's talking to you, we having these discussions. Well, son, you tell me what gives you that perspective. Oh, well, this and that. Well, I don't know. Well, son, I'm not accepting. I don't know is your answer. You have to tell me where did that come from. I'm not mad at you, but I just want to know. Like, you know what I mean? Like, what are you thinking? You know what I mean? Like one of those kind of things.
That's perfect. Man, this is really good. It might have to be a part three. This is
Stop it.
really good. This is like so good because not only is it helping me, and I know it'll help some other parents around here because I feel like us millennial parents,
Sure.
we're lost because we don't know what they're truly battling. I mean, at all socially and especially in school. I mean, if we had beef, there was no social media. Like either we would three-way on the phone or we'd catch you in school. You know what I mean?
Lunchtime. It was like a thing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Uh-huh.
now, before you even get to wake up, it's on social media.
It
They're
didn't
sharing
happen.
it. Yeah,
Sure.
like,
Mm-hmm.
oh man, this is really, really good. This is good. As I digress, I'm so sorry,
No,
but
no, no. This is good. This is good. I really want to make a point on this though. Like you brought up something interesting about teens and like this dialogue of communication. But really, if we think as just parents, the earlier years we're really molding them. Like that's when you should be more like no means no. Like firm. I should say like you should be like really because that they are more they're more what's the word I want to look for? They're more acceptance. Like they're really looking for that guidance at that point in time, if that makes sense, right?
yes.
And
Mm-hmm.
like if you think about like middle school, late middle school years, definitely over that eighth grade year to ninth grade year,
Mm-hmm.
they seeking that independence. They're gonna get really weird. They're trying to they in that funky stage where like I really want this love, comfort, but like I also kind of want to like fist bump you because like that's kind of like strange. I want to be like independent, right? When they get to that phase, think your communication dialogue with them is like, I gave you the skills earlier on. Now I want to see if you can act them out. We're gonna do that in our talk.
Yeah.
You know, because I told you earlier on, we don't lie. So I'm expecting out of you this.
Mm.
And then you supporting that and giving them the opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
And then when you get into high school, then it's like it's almost like I'm gonna use a sport narrative because I always do this with my guys because they always love this. It's like you the coach in high school. Like when you get to those teenage years, middle to late teens, you the coach.
Mm-hmm.
You wanna draw up this play. Hey, driving is coming up. What's your game plan? It's about time to start working. We're going to, do this plan, and you're going to send them out on the field, see if they execute it. Come back, we're going to regroup. Hugs, maybe some dap. It didn't go well. That kind of sucks. It happens in life. What we're going to do to rebound? We still got to do this play. Get out there on the field, go do it, come back. That's going to be a lot of your communication. It's going to be less like, do it this way because I want you to do it this way.
Yeah.
Mm-mm.
Okay. This is good. And my daughter just walked in, so hopefully she can hear some things. But let's move forward on
Yes,
that
ma'am.
part. But that was really good. We're gonna have to have another part because
Yes, ma'am.
I feel we have to have another part.
Yes, ma'am.
Let's just move on. So vulnerability.
Yes.
I feel like in our culture, it doesn't go hand in hand with men. So why would do you think that vulnerability is viewed negatively for men? And how can we begin to change the narrative as mothers, as wives, sisters, even brothers, things like that? How can we change the narrative? So you can just relax and look, you made me upset. I didn't like it.
I think largely because we put stigma on the word in term of vulnerability, right? We make it out to be this thing, whoever feels vulnerable is weak or soft as a whole, not even so much as men or women, like if we're dividing it up, but like just the term itself. And really, I don't necessarily think that's fair because if we think about just like another loose word that's always used is boundaries. And I always try to teach my people like explain what boundary really means. And you see people like stumble all the time. But the reality is boundaries is the area where I draw a line in the sand because my vulnerability or the wounds of my heart will cause me to act differently. So I'm really putting a stance right here. That's what boundary means. And that's not
Mm,
offensive, but people don't see it that way. So therefore they always negotiate their safety.
yes.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm pretty
So
sure men can go through this as well.
yes.
Just to piggyback on that. But I will say that I am my own boundary crosser
Yeah. Yeah. And
because
that's
I
what
feel bad.
mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? But sometimes I
Mm-hmm.
can't interfere with what's going on, but I want to. And then I think about it, even if I do eventually like say no, or hey, why don't you try this? And then maybe
Mm-hmm.
I'll help you. I'll be like,
Mm-hmm.
what if they can't get it?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Well, they need me. That's why they reached out. And then now, after it's all said and done, and now I'm either emotionally all messed up or financially drained or something like that. Um, so yes. So but boundaries could make it seem like um something different for the other party. Can you explain that?
Yeah,
Or they
well,
get upset. What do you
some
mean?
people, right? Like if you set a firm boundary, and we're just talking about communication, and
Mhm.
I'm misreceiving the boundary, it's usually because the way we've been communicating been working perfectly fine for me, and I don't understand the change. Why are we acting different, right?
Okay.
And a lot of times that's coming because this dialogue been great for me. Like I thought we were. Why all of a sudden the change? And usually the change is me as a person, I want to stop negotiating the boundaries. Like I want to stop putting myself in a place where I'm gonna receive hurt or I'm gonna reopen these wounds. And a lot of times we don't know how to communicate that. Therefore, it causes the conflict.
Mm. Something just popped up, so we're going to transition. But let's talk about the boundaries. How do you, how does one receive, let's just say a parent to a child, and maybe there was a lot of trauma growing up, and maybe the child feels like they need to set concrete boundaries, or maybe even go non contact no contact with a parent, with those boundaries, and the parent is just like, well, I raised you, I did this, I did this, I did this, but they're not hearing the emotional impact, or the mental impact or physical impact, what whatever the trauma was. How can a parent receive that, or even vice versa. You know what I mean? And maybe a parent might go no contact with a child,
Sure.
and try to enforce some of those boundaries. Um, how would that look?
It will look more as if an individual is supporting the boundary opposed to enforcing a boundary. Enforcing a boundary is very aggressive, right? I'm trying
Hmm.
to enforce this will. I really want you to see this thing, right? But supporting a boundary is very loving. I'm looking for you to accept this what I'm trying to share with you.
Mm,
I want you to receive this, right? So I always like to give the dialogue of Jesus, right? He's our Lord and Savior, and he went door to door spreading the good news.
hmm.
And what's really crazy to me, and I was always told to read the Bible as a manual on life, right? So like, what's crazy to me is our Lord and Savior was knocking door to door, and like people had the choice, like, you said the good news. I don't know if I believe that. You just brush the sandals off, went to the next.
Yeah.
And think he could have struck them down, right? Like he could have been like, what? You know what I mean?
Or kept going.
Okay,
You know what
okay,
I mean? Or
or
kept
really try to like
talking,
really get, yeah.
convinced. Yeah.
Nah. And then I always like to ask people which one was that more supportive or was he enforcing?
Mm, I
Because
think
if
that's
he
important.
if he would have been aggressive, right? Think about this. If he would have been aggressive, how many people would really believe the message?
Not many, because who are you?
Or how can I accept that you are loving if you trying to enforce?
Mm. So even the tone of the message could change the dynamic. Oh, this is good.
One of the coolest things I learned a lot of things from my wife, but one of the coolest things I learned from my wife is the reason why she don't use cuss words. And the reason why she don't use cuss words is because she wants you to understand what she's trying to express to you. She don't want you to be caught up on the cuss word.
Mm,
And that's great communication because that's what we do. We will hear this thing and then like it's playing in our mind a million times, no matter what you're talking about, and you're missing the context
hmm.
of trying to.
It almost makes it seem like you're punching them. It's
Yeah.
like,
For what? Mm-hmm.
shut your D
Mm-hmm.
mouth or something like what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or, you know what I mean? Like, so now
Yeah.
I didn't hear you say, please shut your mouth. All I heard was,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so
When really
effective
the intent
communication,
and that
positive
communication
communication.
dialogue and that intent gets you way further away from your actual goal. Like
Hmm.
how does that get you
Hmm.
closer to like what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, because I've already shut down.
Yeah.
And don't
Yeah.
raise your voice.
Yeah. All kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, don't raise your voice. Now
Mm-hmm.
we can't even talk.
Mm-hmm.
So I think effective communication,
Mm-hmm.
and communicating and listening to understand is so important. So important when even just building relationships,
Mm-hmm.
whether a mother to a child, a man and a woman, a
Mm-hmm.
coworker, things like that. I think effective communication can go a long way. So, let's talk on it. Relationships and community also play a major role in emotional healing. So, I wasn't a perfect parent. So now, as my kids are expressing themselves and I'm allowing them to have that space, how can I play a role in their emotional healing, as well? You know what I mean? I don't want them to be like, "Oh, I got a therapist, so you go there a therapist," but I want to be a part of it, but I want to be a part of it effectively, and more importantly, I want to support and be, a positive support role for them.
Awesome. I think that's really cool for you. I think that's dope. And I genuinely hope that through this it actually bridges that gap, what you're trying to achieve. Because
Yeah.
I think that's respectable and commendable. Um, Largely, I think we have to do more listening and true change, right? Like it's one thing to listen to somebody, but it's a whole other thing to accept what's being said, right?
Mm,
And when you accept what's being said, then that should come with change in behavior, right? So,
yeah.
like, I oftentimes think about just us as Jesus believers and like saying we believe in the word, but oftentimes people believe in the word for understanding, but if they don't believe in the word for acceptance, then they usually don't change behavior, which then makes you hypocritical, right?
Mhm. Correct.
That's the biggest slight against the culture, right?
Yeah.
So it's accepting that you're flawed. Like I did these things when really my intent was the best. Like I genuinely didn't know at the time that it affects you this way.
Yeah.
I, my heart wasn't in that direction. You know what I mean? But I can accept taking accountability. I can accept my actions, and these are my actions I'm gonna do to like write a new path for us. And
Hmm.
just as a clinical therapist, I will tell you that is super healthy because the brain only goes back to those vulnerable areas if you allow yourself to re-experience them. Right.
Hmm.
So like if you don't give the brain enough exposure to the success that that relationship could have, it only has the negative exposure. So therefore, it's only going to be that.
So let me ask you this. So let's just change it around. Let's say you're my dad, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And some things that you've done to me, and now as an adult, we're talking as adults.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you're expressing that your intent wasn't this, and you're
Sure.
you're accountable and
Mm-hmm.
apologetic, and want to move forward. But are you saying, if I am only fixated on the things that you've done, I won't be able to grow and have a relationship with you?
Yes, ma'am. Correct.
Mm. So
Correct.
not only do you need to get the apology, I need to get the apology from you, but now I have to do some inner work in order,
Have
if
to.
I truly want to have a
If you
relationship with
truly
you
want the
moving forward.
relationship, yes.
Mm. So it still work on both ends.
Has to. Relationships are a two-way street, no matter the dialogue, no matter if it's a parent to a child to another child, man, woman, two-way street. Us, the Lord, two-way street.
Mm.
You expect the Lord to be doing all these tricks and you do nothing.
I like that. I like that. And especially using the Lord, because we often be like, Lord, if you get me out of this, Lord, if you get me out of this, but never even just got up and just said thank you.
Yeah, but like think about that. If that's the only time you communicating to the Lord, wouldn't we say if that was a person, wouldn't we say that's manipulation? They just taking advantage of me.
Yeah.
You
Yes.
know what I mean? Like if you only
Mhm.
spending time with me because you want something from me, that's is that healthy? like
No,
like
no,
would
it
you
does.
accept that from somebody that you was like dating? like you would be,
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
no, not at all. I was just expressing to my kids this morning, like, I have some issues with, a sibling or whatever, and they're subtly reaching out subtly, and I'm like, no, because now I heard through the grapevine you need help, and I'm
Sure,
the person you go to, but now
sure,
I need an apology. I need
sure.
change behavior before we can dive back in and having that relationship. But now, as we're talking, I don't think I want to, because in my head, you're the same person that keeps making the same offenses. So even if my sibling did come to me and be like, you know what, sissy, I'm sorry, this is what I was going through. This is what my intention wasn't to hurt you. I don't think I'm going to be able to hear them with my heart and,
Hmm.
and, and my mind, because you're a repeated offender.
Hmm.
So that's good, because I know that now I need to do the work as well if I do want to mend the relationship.
Have to,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Man, man, that's good.
Absolutely.
That's good. Are you
Here's the
charging
best
me for
part.
this? Because this is therapy.
Here's the hilarious, hilarious. Here's the best part though about it, right? Like that's the whole reason why Jesus judged your heart. It's not about your works. Like you get he's
Yes.
judging the context behind your actions, the intent.
Whew, this is good. Take me to church. So I'm going to skip over one of our questions, and we're going to move right into this one, because you've given a lot of good information and the way of different perspectives that we could talk about. Um, but what message would you give um, to men? And shoot, let me throw something in.
Mm,
Strong females who don't feel that they can be vulnerable. What? what message would you give them to want to open up emotionally, but they fear, like rejection, judgment, or appearing weak? Like my mom, I think the first time that I've ever saw her cry was maybe like 2 years ago.
Hmm.
I'm 39.
Yeah. Wow.
You know what I mean? And I even like talked to my stepdad because, she was in the law enforcement for a long time and she was
Mhm.
just like so hard. And I was just like, how did you bring the softness out of her and vulnerability and that she's able to hug and tell us she loves us? Like, how can we like paint that out there like that?
You know, um, wow, that's a really, really, really good question. Um, I think if our true purpose in life is to follow God, right? And that should be our display of leadership, then you should consider his heart,
Mm.
right? His heart is very forgiving, right? He's a very accepting. And I think all these things we require in relationships, especially if we want these relationships to be healthy. And again, relationships is a mirror. You want to be in a relationship where the dialogue is reciprocated. It should be a reflection. It should be healthy.
Okay, let's piggyback one more time on that.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say in a marriage,
Okay.
um, they've done some things.
Sure.
Let's just say you've done some things to hurt me. Let's go with infidelity.
Okay.
And so you're remorseful, you're accountable,
Yeah.
um, but I'm still, you're trying to work through your own healing from traumas
Sure.
that you have. How can I support you when I'm hurting?
Sure. That's a great question. That's a good question. Before you consider supporting, you have to ask yourself, are you in a place to do, like, can you pour into somebody else's cup if you don't have nothing to pour?
Mm. Okay.
But I do think once you figure that piece out, then I think being able to support that person will be very organic, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and you asking me the question, and what I would like to think is if I was in that circumstance and I was the one that did the fidelity and we did all the accountability and all that stuff, you still got to give space, we talked about earlier, because although I may have did all the grand gestures for apology, it's still upon the other person's time when they are able to receive it and accept it. So I have to give you that space and that opportunity for when you're ready, right? And then when you are, have to support it because like what it really looks like. So I'll give you a space, an opportunity to make a plan, a chance to fix it, make amends, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we can support it, right? We move forward. Then this thing is fixed, and now fixed equals validation. And if validation occurs, then that equals purpose, right? And
Yeah.
then if we get purpose, then that's going to equal desire. And then desire usually equals return. I want to return on these behaviors. I want to keep doing these things to get this dialogue.
That's good. That's good. That's really good and very helpful. I really want to encourage people and a man's support system to give them that space and opportunity to open up, even if it hurts. Open up, even if you feel like this might not be a comfortable conversation to have,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
at least have it so we know. So we
Mhm.
know what to do with the information. And heck, we might need to call you. You know what I
Sure.
mean? So
Sure.
there's some things that you can handle in house, I feel,
Yeah.
between you, God, and
Yeah.
whatever the
Yeah.
situation is. But we might need
Yeah.
God, Mark, and us.
Hilarious. Stop it.
So I mean, oh man, Mark, this was so insightful, and I'm just so glad that you took the opportunity to meet with me and share this information. I know you have so much more information, so I'm probably going to circle back again to talk about it even more. It just reminds us, this conversation, that it's not always, silence doesn't mean that it's strength. I kind of, as we talked about it, it almost kind of decapitates us, to be honest. If you're just silent, you're just slowly, putting yourself in a hole. And silence, sometimes silence is pain without permission to speak.
Sure.
And
Mhm.
we need to get the dialogue going, no matter how hurtful it is, or find something. My sister, in our last interview, really loves Psych Today.
Mhm.
She said that you can build someone up to what you need: sexual orientation, religious
Mhm.
beliefs, black, white,
Mhm.
female,
Mhm.
male,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, grief support,
Mhm.
think all of it, and I believe that's a start.
Yeah.
That's a start. If you feel like you can build someone, almost like a dating app. That's how I feel
Absolutely.
about it when I picked my
Absolutely.
therapist. What I
Yeah.
mean? I was like, okay, yeah, she handles this and this and this.
Yeah.
Okay, and she's this age, perfect.
Mhm.
But to piggyback on that, men, all men, deserve spaces where they can be honest. I believe vulnerable, emotional, and supported is. I
Mhm.
think that's the biggest thing, because I think we took our support back.
Mhm.
As growing up, with the words that we were saying and planning into them.
Mhm.
And then you guys are human,
Mhm.
just like us.
Mhm.
So healing begins when people feel safe enough to be seen fully,
Mhm.
not just halfway, or you can be emotional, but not too emotional.
Sure. Yeah.
Fully
Yeah.
emotional, fully
Mhm.
vulnerable. And I think that, this is a good start. So I want to thank you again for joining me today. Thank you for tuning in to Locked In Real Conversations. And remember, it's definitely more about hair. It's about healing, confidence, and our community. So
Amen.
stay tuned. We'll see you next Sunday.
Awesome.
Thank you. Come on, girl, stop.
That's sweet.